Back, WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and WNST.net as we get ready for the finale of fake football and the always important Governor's Cup. Luke Jones here to discuss maneuverings before the maneuverings. Luke, I know we're all waiting for the text to come out, brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard, of course, and Dennis will be here on Thursday as well. We wait to hear who those names are going to be. The Kamalei Correa thing, I don't think anybody should be shocked by that. I'm a little shocked that the Titans traded for him, and the Dean Pease thing and the Marcus Mariota thing. But this, I don't say came from out of the blue, but an interesting deal the week of, and certainly something from a draft perspective that we need to discuss around here.
Yeah, there's no question about it. I mean, I think there are some different layers to this. So on the surface, you're absolutely right. It's not shocking considering Kamalei Correa had never really established himself as even a rotational member of the defense, and they moved him to outside linebacker. He had the huge Hall of Fame game, 3 sacks, an interception, a forced fumble, and you're saying, my goodness, I mean, maybe
showcase
this is something really, really special, but then you remind yourself, it came against second and third team players. And since then, he hasn't played poorly, but certainly hasn't followed up that performance with anything that was standing out so much that you're saying, my goodness, you need to get him on the field. Just didn't see that. He was very clearly far behind Terrell Suggs and Matthew Judon and Zadarius Smith and even Tim Williams. I would have put him somewhere on par with Tyus Bowser at this point, and certainly Bowser being a year younger in this system and another year of control gave him an advantage in that way. So,
well, Bowser's a guy coming on. I don't know that Correa ever sort of came on other than for an hour in Canton against the third team of the Bears or whatever, right?
Right. I mean, Tyus Bowser, the jury's still very much out on him. I mean, he could be the next Kamalei Correa, but he's a year younger in this process, one less year for that he's been on the field and been in the system. So from that standpoint, it's not surprising. I think anyone who looked at this roster specifically on the defensive side of the ball, you just look at how deep they are at these positions. And we can debate the top-end talent, but when you just talk about that tier of contributors, really at every level, the defensive line, linebackers, and secondary, it's impressive, and it's deep, and they haven't really had too many injuries. So you get to a point where you just say, we can't keep everyone. And as much as in a perfect world, if maybe you had a 65-man roster, let's say, maybe you'd keep Correa around another year with him more focused now at outside linebacker and see if he continues to develop. But the Ravens didn't have that luxury, so this made a lot of sense. As far as current circumstances, and we can certainly get into the clear disappointment that he was as an early second-round pick, as far as current circumstances, to get a sixth-round pick next year, that's kind of impressive considering earlier this month the Browns traded Corey Coleman, their former first-round wide receiver, who has been a disappointment but had done more in the NFL than Correa had. Well, they only got a seventh-round pick in 2020, so it just kind of goes to show that just because you're a high draft pick a couple years back does not guarantee that you're going to be worth much in terms of draft capital in the here and now. So I was surprised. I don't know if I'd go so far to say I was wowed or overly impressed because it's only a sixth-round pick, but they were able to get something for him rather than potentially cutting him. I think he would have been on the 53-man roster when it was all said and done, but when you're able to move him, get something in return, and now that opens up a roster spot for another defensive lineman, another wide receiver. We know they need another tight end for the time being with Hayden Hurst sidelined. Then it makes a lot of sense to move on from Correa, who, let's face it, at best was going to be a special teams contributor this year unless there were some injuries at that outside linebacker spot.
Well, give me your, elevator speech on Correa. What went wrong for him? And I guess in the same way we look back at what went wrong for Arthur Brown. And I guess over 20 years we would say about Ozzie, well, what went right with Dallas Thomas or Bart Scott or Ed Hartwell or any other system guy that managed to at least get on the field. But between, I guess, Kindle, Cody, I'm talking about Dan Cody. You know, there have been a bunch of these guys. Simon, another guy that could play that left. What's up with Correa? Do you expect to see him on the field October 14th when we show up in Tennessee?
Well, I mean, the Titans are banged up at linebacker right now, and I don't know all the minutia there, but certainly they have some guys that are sidelined and have been sidelined with injuries. So they're hoping that he can give them some depth. I don't think he's necessarily going to be starting, but he's going to get an opportunity to make an impression. My impressions of Kamalei Correa is, I mean, coming out of Boise State, you can even go back and look at some of the draft profiles, reports, analysis. Everyone really liked him from an upside standpoint, but there were some sentiments his final year in college that, man, why isn't this guy a little more productive than what he looks like he should be? So you have that, but that's something that applies to a lot of college players over time, and there have been plenty who weren't all that terribly productive at the collegiate level, and then they figure it out. They stay healthy. They're in a better system fit, whatever it might be. But I was talking to a former member of the Ravens organization last offseason, and I basically asked, what did the organization see in Kamalei Correa? Because the outsider impression is this was an edge defender that the Ravens brought in, and they moved him to inside linebacker. And they had a need there, but never seemed to take to that. But what that individual told me was the thing that they liked most about Correa coming out of Boise State was they thought his skill set just made him a completely versatile linebacker that they could line up in any of their 4 linebacker spots, and they thought he would be able to do a solid job. The problem is, and this individual even alluded to it, that at least in his opinion at the time, yes, he showed skills that made him someone that you would view as versatile, but he didn't really excel in any one area. And talking to another member of the organization at one point, one reason that they kind of kept him away from being an edge rusher was they didn't think his arms were long enough, which you can kind of get away with at the collegiate level, but going up against an offensive tackle, you're going to have your issues at the NFL level. But long story short, it's great to talk about a player having versatility, and you love that in someone like an Albert McClellan, for example, a former rookie free agent, spent a year on the practice squad, has carved out a really, really nice 8-year career, being a versatile special teams contributor and a guy that can line up at 4 different linebacker spots on game day if you have an injury or two. The problem is that doesn't really translate to what you're hoping to get out of an early second-round pick. You're hoping you're going to get a guy that's going to be at least a solid starter, and you're hoping there could be some extra upside there. Keep in mind, the Ravens were picking in the top 6 in those first few rounds, in that 2016 draft, and that was an early second-round pick. Now, they moved back a couple times. It is worth noting that with the draft capital that they collected in moving back, they drafted Matt Judon and Chris Moore, so that's a little bit of a saving grace, certainly, but at the same time, you still picked the player when there were other individuals in that second round. They passed on Miles Jack and Noah Spence, but those were red flag guys. I don't have a major problem with them doing that. They moved down, they got some extra picks, and they ended up getting Matt Judon, who looks like he could be an above-average outside linebacker for quite some time. But even when they did pick Correa, guys that came off the board shortly thereafter, Derrick Henry, Michael Thomas, a Pro Bowl receiver for the Saints, Deion Jones, a Pro Bowl linebacker for the Falcons. Those 3 came off in the next 10 picks. So it just goes to show that the Ravens really liked Kamalei Correa, and it just didn't work out. And I know a lot of people, and this is something that we've been doing more and more this offseason, and the team's even been a little guilty of this. So many people have wanted to blame Dean Pease. They said, he moved him to inside linebacker. I never got the sense, and based on talking to members of this organization, that wasn't a unilateral call from Pease. There was Correa's perceived versatility is what drew them to him. So,
but being physically versatile and then being able to read offenses, no flow, get to the ball, make a play. He couldn't do that at any level or he'd be on the field. At some point, I guess it is a tremendous disappointment, and to your point, they salvaged a pick out of it at this point. But it is worth talking about that you can only have so many of these before you wind up 4-12, quite frankly, where your first round picks, your Elams and your Perrymans don't get onto the field. I mean, it's sort of a tribute to their ability to sign some free agents and some other guys, the Ryan Jensen types who've stepped up, and the Wagner types who stepped up and played well, because the drafts have been spotty, and that's how you don't make the playoffs every year, right?
Well, here's the thing with their drafts, and this explains why they haven't been 4-12. And you mentioned it; they have made some good free agent signings, although not all of their free agent signings have been all that great. I mean, the jury's still out on Tony Jefferson, considering the money that they gave him and what they got in his first year. But
I mean, the Steve Smiths and the Weddles, and they've managed to pick up some pieces and get them on the field and get them playing.
Well, I mean, every team needs. Every team has to have some free agent. But my point is, the reason why they haven't been 4-12 with some of the misses that they've had in the early rounds is they've continued to be superb, absolutely excellent in finding late round contributors. That 2016 draft is a perfect example. Let's go by that draft kind of day by day. First day, Ronnie Stanley. Look, Stanley's been a solid left tackle, and you hope he still has another tier, and he very well could, as he's only entering his third season. But to this point, he's been solid. As the 6th overall pick, he hasn't wowed you. He hasn't been overwhelming. He's been solid, and not bad, but he hasn't been a great pick.
And I've never thought I wanted the kid with the weed gas mask either. I've never looked and said, what happened if we would have taken him instead, right?
To be very clear, I'm not being critical of the Ronnie Stanley pick. I think it's been fine. I think it's been solid. And he's still, entering his third year, still has a chance to get to a Pro Bowl level. I think there's still the possibility of him hitting another level. The big key for him is he's been someone who's had nagging injuries, not enough to keep him out. But beside the point, that pick's been fine. Correa, bust. Bronson Kafusi, I'm guessing we're going to see him cut over the next few days. Bust. So early second and third round picks, guys that should have had a chance to at least be starters for you, and they've struggled to even be minor contributors, that's not good. But then you go to day 3 and go down that 4th round. Chris Moore, Tavon Young, Alex Lewis, Willie Henry, Kenneth Dixon, 5th round, Matthew Judon. I mean, just that list right there of, you're talking about 3 projected starters entering 2018 in Judon, Lewis, and Willie Henry, even though Henry's going to be on the sideline to start the year. He was going to start at the 3 technique spot. And then you have a couple other guys who have been contributors, and a guy in Kenneth Dixon who contributed his rookie year and still has a chance to be a big-time contributor. And, I completely forgot Maurice Kennedy, who was their nickel last year and is a solid depth piece for them. That 2016 draft, an extraordinary day 3. I mean, any team will tell you if you can come away from a draft with 3 starters and 3 or 4 other contributors, then you've done a whale of a job. The problem is you think about the upside, and what have we talked about most when it comes to the Ravens roster the last few years? The injuries are one. The other, the lack of playmakers, the lack of high-end difference makers. When do you typically get those guys? Well, you can get them anywhere. I'm not saying that that's impossible. And, look what happened with Alex Collins, and he was a difference maker last year. But the highest probability in finding playmakers, in finding that high-end talent is where? The first 2 or 3 rounds of the draft, and that's where the Ravens have had their issues. They've had Elam and Arthur Brown and Kamalei Correa and Brashad Perriman and Max Williams. I mean, just go down the list. They're just, and no one bats 1,000. And contrary to popular belief, the Ravens had some misses from 1996 through 2012 as well. I mean, there was a Patrick
There was
Johnson.
a Travis Taylor in there.
Yeah. So it's not as though it was perfect. So by no means am I saying
Deron Jenkins. Let's throw him in there too.
Right. By no means am I implying that they need to be perfect, but they've had fewer or they've had more misses in the first 3 rounds of the draft over the last 5 years than they had in most of their existence. And that's where you're really hindered when you consider some of the guys that walked away from this team or were traded away. You go down the list: Ray Lewis, Ed Reed, Anquan Bolden, the guys that were still important in the first half of the Joe Flacco era, let's just call it the first half of the John Harbaugh era, and you've struggled to replace some of those guys. Now, some of it was just, it was going to happen. Ray Lewis was going to retire. Ed Reed was going to retire. Even, he left for a year, but he retired after that. Some of it was self-inflicted, and then, like Bolden, for example, and then you have some rotten luck with someone like a Dennis Pitta. So when you miss on those early picks, it's great to make up for it with some of the players that they've been able to find in rounds 4, 5, 6, and 7 at times, but you're still kind of covering your tracks. You're still filling in the gaps, and we've talked about that a ton at the safety position. They're still feeling the effects of the Matt Elam blown pick. I mean, they really are when you consider how much you're paying Eric Weddle and Tony Jefferson now, and as much as I feel okay about those two and feel solid about those two, I'm not going to sit here and say that I think that's the best safety tandem in the league, and they're paying it like it should be really, really close to that.
Well, dude, one of the reasons they went and got Correa was because Brown and Simon, and the guys that they drafted a couple years before to be a part of the front seven didn't work out. So
no doubt. There's always a trickle-down effect. There really is, and Correa's just, he's one of the examples here. I mean, you were hoping when you drafted him as early as the Ravens did in the second round, you were hoping that maybe he wasn't going to be Terrell Suggs' replacement, but he certainly was going to be Courtney Upshaw's replacement, and he was going to step in and be a good Sam linebacker or a good edge guy, or be a good weak side inside linebacker like the Ravens, I guess initially pegged him for. So clearly, I think and John Harbaugh even said this on Tuesday after he was asked about Correa being traded, that the sentiment now is that he is better on the outside, and you can ask the question, well, why'd you try to fit a square peg into a round hole for the first 2 years of his career? And that's fair, but that was an organization-wide perception that Correa could be that versatile guy, that he could be someone that you could just plug in and he would figure it out, and it just didn't turn out that way. And he ended up being much more Albert McClellan than Adalys Thomas or Jarrett Johnson or Terrell Suggs. And when Albert McClellan's a undrafted free agent that spends a year on the practice squad, that's a great find. When that's a second-round pick, that's not good.
He is Luke Jones. He is Baltimore Luke out on Twitter and Luke at WNST.net talking about the exit of Kamalei Correa. One name that came up as I went through here is Brent Urban. Anything you want to say on him? Because, boy, he's been around longer than anyone. I mean, I go back, 5-6 drafts now on Brent Urban. Boy, they loved him last year. He looked great. He looked like he was going to be a real difference maker last year on the team.
Yeah, and that the story of his career has just been injuries, even going back to high school for him. Going back to his early days at Virginia, he's just had injury after injury after injury. I mean, you see the frame. I mean, you're talking about a guy that's 6'6", 6'7", 300 pounds.
Very J.J. Watt looking as a human being,
no
right?
question.
Yeah.
Just the eyeball test, he looks like he could be that kind of player, but he just has not been able to stay on the field. The good news is he's had a really healthy preseason, coming off of a Liz Frank injury, which is not a good injury. I mean, Jimmy Smith has spoken about even 3-4 years later, he still feels the effects of that, despite the fact that he has been able to play at a high level when he's been on the field. But in the case of Urban, I think he's going to be their 5 technique. I don't think there's any reason to think he won't be that if he's healthy. I think they'll probably try to have him on a little bit more of a pitch count in an effort to keep him healthy, especially early in the season. But they're hoping he can be a rock-solid 5 technique. They're hoping he can be someone who slides inside in sub-packages and passing situations and rush from an interior spot. And I think they still have high hopes for him. I mean, they were able to bring him back on a 1-year deal for next to nothing, about $1 million, maybe just a hair over that off the top of my head. But that's because his availability has been his biggest weakness.
Is he going to play 50, 60 snaps next Sunday against the Bills? I mean,
he won't play 50. I mean, I don't. First of all, none of their defensive linemen play that much. But I think the formula for someone like Brent Urban, who has had the injuries that he's had, is if you can get 25 or 30 really good snaps out of him to start the year, on a per-game basis and then see how he's handling that physically and work in guys like Chris Wormley into the rotation, because Urban's only under contract for this season, so you got to be careful from that standpoint that you want to develop some of your younger guys. But if he can give them 30 snaps a game and bat down a pass every now and then and pick up a sack every now and then and be a good player against the run, push the pocket, make the quarterback uncomfortable when he's rushing up the middle, then I think they'd be thrilled with that. But coming off of a tough injury and just knowing his injury history to begin with, if Brent Urban's going to be your plan A, you better have you better have a plan B. You better have if he's your number one, you better have a 1A, because he just hasn't been able to stay on the field. But the good news is, bringing him back, it's not like the Ravens made a major financial risk in doing so.
Well, you and I will be getting together to discuss all the cuts over the weekend. You can find us out in the BuyAToyota.com audio vault 24 hours a day from anywhere in the world on your mobile device by downloading the TuneIn Radio app. We come in no static at all, just like our partners at Model Lyric bringing Steely Dan to sing some FM in for my 50th birthday. You can learn more about what they do at Model-Lyric.com. You can find us and listen live in the BuyAToyota.com audio vault. You can also get our morning newspaper delivered to you at 7 a.m. each and every morning. It's all brought to you by Planet Fitness and PlanetFitness.com, where it's still $10 a month to get in the best shape of your life, guaranteed. There's always the lunk alarm, and they're always judgment-free at Planet Fitness. The Maryland Jockey Club also sponsoring our morning newspaper, where the entries are in the morning newspaper every morning, as well as on the front of WNST.net. They return to Laurel next week. Weekend racing. We got the Maryland Million coming up on October the 20th, the DeFrancis Dash coming up in 2 weeks. Big things at Laurel Park. Learn more on the front of WNST.net. Last but never least, any breaking news and all of these cuts that are coming out. Yes, Luke and I will be talking about them on the radio, but you'll get them first on the WNST Tech Service. It's all brought to you by Coons Ford of Security Boulevard. Dennis Kolatzis will be here on Thursday, driving you home from 3 until 5. I am Nestor. I'm on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, Snapchat, Instagram, streaming live on our Facebook as well as our YouTube WNSTV channel. We are WNST.net, AM 1570, and WNST, Towson, Baltimore, and we never stop talking Baltimore sports.